Okay, I've got backup sound today, so I'm covered in microphones and who knows what. I'm just going to bring up my notes. All right, so today's session is titled How Stuff Works, Creation's Blueprints. And that's my update on what is traditionally known as creation ordinances in theological terminology. Historically, the creation ordinances have been usually considered a limited number of things like marriage, work, Sabbath. They are things that appear in the creation narrative itself and describe realities that God has baked into the fabric of creation for the blessing of all people. You know, as time has gone on and the attack on creation has got more aggressive, more creation ordinances have sort of emerged. For example, once upon a time, it wouldn't have been so necessary to point out that gender is a creation ordinance. But in the modern age, all of a sudden, we're dealing with a situation where we have to point out that gender is a creation ordinance. And so there's a couple of extras there. So I don't want to pretend that I'm strictly in the theological tradition of creation ordinances, hence why I've slightly renamed it. How Stuff Works, Creation's Blueprints. There are a few that I'm going to deal with today. I want to speak to a matter which comes up in Genesis 1, which is that of authority in the earth, in God's creation. I wish to talk about the idea of work being instituted in paradise for man to accomplish in God's creation. I'm going to talk about Sabbath and what that means to be part of God's creation. I will talk about male and female. I will briefly talk about marriage, and there may be one more. Yes, there's life, which goes into the issue of family, and there is also one which, again, wouldn't have been discussed so much historically as a creation ordinance, and it probably isn't strictly, but it is something that was there in God's creation. It was the idea of justice in the sense of punishment for wrongdoing. And again, that's something I feel like I need to address because there are a number of movements, particularly movements in the cultural Marxist framework, that are now saying that justice is oppressive and that the enforcement of laws is in itself something which is white, colonial, hegemony, etc. And so we'll get to the issue of what God means by the idea of punishing wrong and how that is very important. But to start with, I want to take up this idea of what is a creation ordinance. First and foremost, it's this simple. It is a creation reality. And I use the word reality very deliberately. It's real. It's part of creation. It's something that is true about how things are made. Therefore, it is baked into the very structure of this world in which we live. Therefore, these are things which are good for everybody. You know, a lot of these creation ordinances are actually the business of government policy as much as they are the business of personal endeavour. And a lot of people say, well, why would you impose, like let's say marriage, creation ordinance. Why would you impose that on a non-Christian? It's a creation ordinance. It's part of the order of how things were made. It's not just an instruction to Christians. This is a reality of the world for the blessing of all people. And you say, well, so what? What about that? And we live in a very strange time where people say, well, that might be true, but I feel like X or Y and I don't care. As if the reality of things doesn't matter. Well, I'm here to tell you it does matter. If you live against reality for long enough, you will reap the rewards of doing that. And of course, Romans 1 actually touched on that issue, saying there are consequences for trying to be Lord over creation itself and recreate creation in your own image. But these realities are not there, the scriptures teach us, for us to do with them as we please. These realities are to be treated after the fashion that God intended for them. Things are made a certain way because God intended them to be treated a certain way or to play out a certain way. We see things purpose in their creation. That comes out in a philosophical concept called teleology. How something is made tells us what it's for. And you can see many examples. I could go back to Rob's session when he was talking about transgenderism. And he reads, for example, from Matthew 19:4, where Jesus says, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female?" You say, so what? Well, Jesus says, well, therefore. And he gives you the implication of why God made them male and female. And it was for the purposes of, first and foremost, marriage, which is the very subject he then launches into. It wasn't for no reason. And so we treat things according to how they're intended to be treated in creation. We also looked at several scriptures I'm losing track of days, it might have been the first day. I think it was the first day I was here, so Tuesday. And you could look at, for example, Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. Here's a creation ordinance: be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And then in Genesis chapter, what did I say, Genesis 6, did I? But later on in Genesis 9, it points out that has implications for our attitude to life. It says, don't be those who take life, but be those who are fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. In other words, it's not just set in creation for no reason. It has implications for how we treat people and how we treat life itself. Also, you could go to James, and James points out that the creation order, the fact that we are not animals, in James chapter 3, means that we have obligations upon us for moral behaviour because of the way God has ordered creation. And also, people are worthy of moral treatment because they were made in the image of God and nothing else was. And so the way God has made things matters. And this I could quote all day until the cows come home. Scriptures from the New Testament that say, because that's how it was made, or that point us back to creation. And one of the number one areas that happens is in the area of male and female, and we'll get to that at the back end of this lecture. So we are to treat creation as God intended, and when we do that, it is a blessing. When we rebel against God's intention for creation, it is a sin. It is a sin, and we lose the blessing, or worse. Or worse. There could be actual, I'm going to use the word positive again in a way that's a bit counterintuitive, but there could actually be additional consequences for us that are negative. Not just that we would miss something, but that there would be some negative outcome as well. An attack, and this is something we learned yesterday. Yesterday we went through Romans 1. And we went through Romans 1 and we saw this proclivity that is in the human race, which is very much of the moment in our culture right now, which is that people raise themselves up to be as gods. And that was the original temptation. And when they raise themselves up to be as gods, what they seek to do is take on the role of creators. And he gave the example there of homosexuality, basically pointing out that this is clearly contrary to biological construction, and yet we decide that we can do it because we want to rewrite the rule book. And then I said, well, the modern example is the transgender example. You know, the funny line about being 6'7" with hairy hands, but, I'm a woman, I'm beautiful, and the law will tell you that you have to say so. There is a situation where people are saying, no, we are the creators now. We will seat ourselves in God's throne in this respect. And an attack on creation is therefore an attack on God himself. Because God is first creator. Even before he's redeemer, he is creator. And the implications of his creatorship are reaffirmed throughout Scripture. And attacks on creation are consistently described as attacks against God and against God's purpose. And therefore it is sin, as I said before. Now, in relation to these creation ordinances, the fall has spoiled the things that we read about in creation to some extent. So there are lots of perfect things described in creation about male and female, about punishment for wrongdoing, about authority and what that was like, about marriage and about children and about Sabbath. And we need to remember, like we talked about in relation to the image of God, these things are pre-fall. Post-fall, they have been spoiled to some degree. They are no longer perfect. And you see, this is very clear, that the whole creation has fallen from a scripture like Romans chapter 8, verse 19, where it says this, it says, "For the eagerly awaiting creation waits for the revealing of the sons and daughters of God." So it's waiting for the resurrection. "For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. And not only that, but we also ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons and daughters, the redemption of our body." So creation has been subjected to corruption by God through the fall. Our will also in the fall, and we talked about the fact that we were in the image of God, now in the image of Adam. What's the thing that's come in? Sin, unrighteousness, rebellion. So our will also rebels against these things and the standards that they imply. And that is part of our sinful nature. So not only are these things corrupted now, but when we look at the standards they imply from the beginning, we don't always like it. The sinful person doesn't always want to pursue it. But in Christ, we are called to restore them. We are called to honour his creation intent. And that's the consistent theme of the New Testament. We are called to show the goodness and the perfection of God's intention. And the primary way in which we do that is restoration to relationship with God in salvation, because that's as it was in the beginning, perfect. But then there's all these other things as well that God has instituted for our good. And we, as those who are looking for this time in the future when all things will be redeemed, we want to live up to those standards now. We'll fully bear the image of God then. We're being transformed from one degree of glory into that image now. The creation will be redeemed then. We treat it and we submit to the intention God has for it now as Christians. So I'm going to deal with several blueprints. That's all preface, that's introduction, so that we all now know what is a creation ordinance, or what are these creation realities, which is probably even a better way to put it, because it puts us in the framework. What exactly are they? The first one I want to deal with is authority, because we read in Genesis 1 the other day how that when man and woman were created, God gave them authority. And he gave them authority over the created world, of course in submission to God. They weren't made into gods, they were always creatures, but they had this job of delegated authority. And the job of delegated authority extended to having dominion over the earth, extended to subduing the earth, and extended to being fruitful and multiplying and filling the earth. And you can see, therefore, in the administration of that, this authority and the scope of it and the complexity of it was going to grow. It was going to grow. Today, we see that we live in a world where authority is necessary. And one of the things we learn from the Bible is that God intends authority to exist in the world for its proper management and its proper governance. And that comes to the sphere in which I live, which is governing authority, because I deal with government all the time. And in Romans chapter 13, we get our little blueprint for governing authority. And you can turn there if you want, actually, Romans 13. This is like a series of mini primers on a range of subjects from this point forward. First one being authority. So this is in Romans 13. Every person is to be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behaviour, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of the one in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive praise from the same. For he is a servant of God to you for your good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a servant of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of these things you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. And he goes on to say, pay your taxes, and give respect to whom respect, and honour to whom honour is due. Now, we find out actually that in the world, God intends governing authority to exist. That's the most important thing. I did a talk once about government, and I had a guy come up to me afterwards and he said, I'm a Christian anarchist. And I sort of had to gently explain to him that you can't be a Christian anarchist because you're basically opposing what God has appointed. You're opposing, as it says here in Romans 13, the ordinance of God. And it has been so since the beginning. So God means government to exist. And it says there in the first verse several times. It says, there is no authority except from God. Those that exist have been appointed by God. Whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. This is the ordinance of God, etc. So it means it to exist. And the essence of government is this business of authority, which I've just isolated. And what that does is, it makes it timeless. It reaches behind the system of government. It doesn't say anything about a democracy. It doesn't say anything about a theocracy. It doesn't say anything about a monarchy. It doesn't say anything about the judiciary or the legislature or the executive or the administrative branches of government. It doesn't say anything about that. It just says governing authority, which is something that many people in the modern world possess. Here in Canberra, I think the whole suburb of Martyn pretty much is public servants. They are all people who are exercising to some degree in their own delegated way governing authority. You've got a high court, you've got a federal court, you've got a federal circuit court, you've got your state courts, your supreme courts, your district courts, your magistrates' courts. All that's the judiciary. They are all people exercising public governing authority. The police force, right? It says they don't bear the sword in vain. Well, the modern example would be the gun. We've got police walking around with guns on their hips. They all are exercising governing authority, police departments. There are a huge number of people in the administration of governing authority today, and in every society it's different. It doesn't really matter what the particular system of government at play is. It could be anything. But see, what the Apostle Paul does is he identifies the fact that this is authority. This is governing authority. And here's the interesting thing. Authority, all authority, and we saw this in creation, and we see it here, all authority comes from God. All authority comes from God. And therefore it must be exercised properly in subjection to God, in submission to God. You see this in several places. Matthew 18:18, what does Jesus say? He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Or you see in Revelation chapter 1, he says it refers there to Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn from the dead, and the ruler of the kings on earth. There is a greater king. There is someone who is more authoritative, but not just more authoritative, someone who actually has the authority and gives it to others. And you learn that when Jesus speaks to Pilate, for example. And Pilate says to him, don't you know that I have authority over you? What does Jesus say straight back? He says, you would have no authority at all unless it was given to you from above. Which is a sobering reminder for Pilate. Whether he got the memo or not, I don't know. His authority is actually God's authority. When I worked in one law firm in particular, and the partner that I worked for there was a guy who, a number of his clients were sort of really high net worth individuals. And they were people of extreme wealth. And whenever you find someone of extreme wealth, you're going to find complex corporate structures everywhere. It does your head in. But one of the things that they do is they set up a lot of trusts. A lot of trusts. And usually there's trusts within trusts within trusts. But the essence of a trust, just to make it really simple, is let's say that you've got a really wealthy person and they've got an overflow of riches and wealth and assets. And they need to manage these assets. Well, one way they might do that is they might transfer a whole bunch of that wealth into a trust. And then you set up a trustee. And the trustee's job is to use all that wealth, those assets, those goods, in the best interests of the true owner, who is the rich guy. Now, I know there's so many people in that circumstance here this morning, of course, with an overflow of wealth and assets, but what Scripture really is describing is a situation where God has an overflow of all authority. There is a species of that authority which He gives on trust to some, and He calls it governing authority, and they are to exercise that authority in the earth in the best interests of the true owner, who is God. Now, if only that memo were received by every parliamentarian and judge and who knows, these people will be held accountable to God for what they did with His authority. Now, that is their job. Our job is described in Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2, and it is to submit to and to honour governing authority. And that is because we submit to and we honour God's purpose and God's design. These creation realities are not ours to do with as we please. We submit to what God has ordained, which is that governing authority must exist in the earth. And by the way, even corrupt governing authority is usually better than no governing authority. Anarchy is actually the worst case scenario. So even a very corrupt government is better than anarchy. And so God has ordained that this would be so. Rebellion against the government is not a Christian trait. And it basically never has been. Nearly. Christians have not been revolutionary, rebellious people for this reason. And it's interesting, the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter and others, they're writing in this ancient society of Christians, and they're talking to them about submission, they're talking to them about honouring, they're talking to them about paying their taxes. They are living under tyranny. They are living under actual tyranny. I mean, you read Revelation and there's John saying, I'm exiled on the Isle of Patmos for the testimony of Jesus and so on. Don't rebel, honour, submit. It's a pretty tough command. And many of these people are Jews. And they're a revolutionary people. I mean, the Maccabean rebellion wasn't that long before. And they're saying, don't do it. Honour what God has appointed. That's a fairly significant instruction. And I feel this sort of coming up today a little bit. People, I gave a talk where I didn't make this caveat once, where I was talking about governing authority, and a guy put his hand up and he said, but what about? And he put out all these bad things that the government does. I said, you're feeling just like the ancient Christians must have felt when they read this. I mean, are you serious? Yeah, serious. Honour what God has appointed. There is, of course, a line. What's the line? Well, it's very simple, very straightforward. It is Acts chapter 5. It's in Acts, and it's the apostles when they get hauled in. I always like to make the joke, they get hauled into the old anti-discrimination tribunal, which was the Sanhedrin, and they're saying, you need to stop speaking about Jesus, you need to stop there's a bit of hate speech going on here. And they're trying to stop what they're doing, and they send them away, and the apostles, they say, we must obey God rather than men. And they break the law, or they go, more correct to say, they go against the governing authority. And the reason for that is they were asked to do something that they could not do whilst also remaining in obedience to God. That's the line. Otherwise, and look, this is not on the notes, but it's something I've been thinking about lately, because I think we're in a time where this will be tested. And there'll be many moments where we just want to go against the governing authorities, or we want to stir up some kind of protest or rebellion movement. I think except in the most unbelievably extreme circumstances, and there always will be outliers, that's not the Christian way, and that's not what we're called to do. It really only makes sense when you understand that ultimately Christ's kingdom is not of this world. He makes a very important statement in the Gospels where he says, my kingdom is not of this world, or else my servants would fight. We don't fight in the earthly power. We don't set up armies and go to war and all the rest of it, because actually we're not trying to bring God's kingdom in through earthly power structures. He doesn't actually require them. That doesn't mean we let them go to pot and we don't have any involvement in them and we don't care. They all matter. They all matter because they are God's ordinance and they are God's servants. Therefore, whilst we must honour and submit to them, they also must be called to account in an appropriate and a proper way for their actual duty. Let me finish this point by saying this. I said that they have this authority on trust from God. There's something else that's said, which is that they are servants of God and ministers of God. That's significant. Growing up, there's a lot of people in the church that I was in who were very anti-political. And they believed that Christians should not be involved in the political square. And I wasn't very old when I read this chapter. And I thought to myself, well, hang on a minute. And Martyn Luther made a similar observation. If God, or if Scripture calls these people ministers of God and servants of God, who else is going to be able to acquit that duty other than a Christian? I mean, who else can serve God? Who else can minister for God? Who else can do that? Who else can be in the ministry of government other than someone who's a Christian? And I've met plenty of people, even in the Australian political system, who I believe are called to that role. And that is where God has placed them. And it is a ministry for the Christian to do if we're called into it. So they are ministers and they are servants. So they are under God, which mirrors the creation purpose. It is a God-given role, and they are, quote unquote, in the ministry. I don't know if you, maybe that's just the church I come from, where people talk about people being in the ministry, which is, having usually a full-time evangelistic role. So the ministry of governments, that's what the question is then, what is the ministry? What is the service? And it's encapsulated, actually, it's very, very clear. It's repeated time and time again through the Bible. And I feel the need to say this because people are confused about what governments are actually for. A lot of people are starting to treat the government as a person, as if the government has all the duties that they have. So, for example, the one way that this happens on the conservative side of the fence is that you see, the government, it says thou shalt not steal. So, more centralised government is wrong because you're stealing from the people. I'm like, you're told not to steal. The government is actually given the power to levy taxes. There's no problem. It says more than one. Jesus himself said, pay your tax, right? And you see it on the other side of the spectrum where people say, well, we love our neighbour through government. And we want to vote for a government that's going to love our neighbour. So you're told to love your neighbour. I mean, the Good Samaritan is the example par excellence of neighbour love. He did it himself. It cost him quite a lot. It was pretty risky, and it came from him. You don't vote for a government that's going to love your neighbour. You love your neighbour. The government can't love anyone. It can just throw money at stuff, and it doesn't cost it anything because it actually prints the money. Love is person to person. It's costly action for another. It takes something from you. It's just all messed up once you start to put those personal obligations in the context of government. Government is set up as a separate entity because it has specific obligations and responsibilities that we can't do. What's the point otherwise? And the basic essence of it is this. And I'll mention several scriptures. The first comes from 1 Kings chapter 3, and it's the prayer of Solomon. Everyone knows what Solomon prayed for. He prayed for wisdom. Very few people know why he prayed for wisdom, because his prayer had 2 points. One was the what and the other one was the why. And he prayed for wisdom, and he said, that I might discern between that which is good and that which is evil, for how else am I to govern this your great people? So he knew that the essence of government was discerning right and wrong. And then it continues. In the Old Testament, we have all these kings, and you read through their little biographies. Some are short, some are long, some are positive, some are negative. And all these kings had accomplishments, even if it was just that they got assassinated after 1 year. But some of them were, they tore down the high places, or they built up the high places, or they entered into alliances with other kingdoms, or they had political victories, or there was economic reforms, or there was this, or there was that. But every single one had the same thing written on his headstone, on his grave. God finished, or the scriptures finish, each of their biographies with the same statement. And it says either he did that which was right in the sight of God, and he died, or he did that which was wicked in the sight of God all the days of his life, and he died. In other words, it came down to a question of righteousness, of right and wrong. That's what the essence of their role was. And it's picked up in the New Testament, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13. It talks about governors as sent by God to reward those who do good and punish those who do evil. It's picked up here in Romans 13 where he says, if you do evil, he does not bear the sword in vain. He is there to punish the wrongdoer. If you do good, do not fear. He is there to reward the one who does good. What is this business of punishing wrong, rewarding good? In a word, Proverbs 14, Solomon again, righteousness exalts a nation, sin is a reproach to any people. So what is the government? The government is a standard bearer for what is right and wrong. And that's what a law is. Every time you write a law, you are saying what is in and what is out, what is right, what is wrong. You can't get away from it, can you? So this is descriptive as much as it is prescriptive. And so, when we vote, I say to people, vote for a government that will most closely uphold what is right, a standard of righteousness. And then you go and love your neighbour. And then you go and do not steal. But you vote for a government that is a standard bearer for right and for wrong. Because that is a key role that they have in a post-fall world. Of course, that would have been perfectly so pre-fall. It no longer is. So, governing authority. It's been there since creation. It is there today. Creation tells us a great deal about how to interact with it. In a fallen world, we have these additional pieces that are put together by Scripture for us. Let me deal with, what's the time? I might deal with, how's everyone feeling? Can we do one more? Yeah, okay, cool. All the people who wanted to say no were too shy to say no, so we just got the yeses. Let's go to, I'm going to say stewardship. Stewardship. That's the word that's often given to it. It's not the word in the Bible. Some people say creation care. Some people, I just want to say our relationship to the created world. There are principles. It's a little bit like government. Like, I haven't actually told you really quite how to run a government, but I've given you the organising principle to start with, right? And that's what the Bible does on these issues. It gives you foundations. Of course, it doesn't deal with the details. It doesn't prescribe a system of government. It doesn't tell you how to decide what clause 78A subsection B13C should say about whether a car's registered on Easter Island. I don't know. All of that is up to wisdom and all the rest of it. These are basic organising principles that are foundations. So stewardship's the same. So I'm not here to give you a climate science lecture. I'm not here to get into all of that, but I'm here to give you some principles which will prevent us from going wrong in this very contested and very controversial area. The terms. When it comes to our relationship to creation, the end of Genesis 1, the terms used are have dominion, subdue, rule over, fill the earth, cultivate, and tend. Those two are the last two are in chapter 2. So it doesn't say steward. It says dominion, subdue, rule over, fill the earth, cultivate, and tend. You see there's a couple of things going on in those words. There are some implications of those words. The first implication is that creation is for man and woman, not the other way around. The order matters. Creation is for man and woman. It is not sacred. It is not to be deified. It is not to be elevated at cost to humanity. It is for. It's for our good, for our blessing, for our multiplication, for our growth, and for our needs. Creation is a resource that is given for our use. And the refrain in not only the Adamic covenant, but also the Noahic covenant, is that God says, I have given you every plant yielding food, every fruit, every this, No, you come around, there's also animals to eat as well, and God gives of the creation as a resource. Also, creation is to be subdued. Subdued. That means to bring it under control, because it is a little bit unwieldy, and it does tend to be inhospitable at times to human existence. But you can see we've subdued this plot of creation, haven't we? We're in a room with an air conditioner on, and we're doing great. We wouldn't be if we hadn't done that. It would be a different circumstance. But it is to be subdued. And these are things I'm saying at the moment that you won't hear from culture. We're going to get to the careful stuff in a minute, but just bear in mind these words are here. And I looked into the Hebrew meaning of the words dominion and subdue, and they're used throughout the Bible, just to be sure that I'm right. And it does mean to bring under control, to make subservient, and to dominate. And I've got to be very careful in this. It is also used often in the sense of violating, but I just want to be careful here. I think the reason for that is probably if you pluck up a turnip and you eat it, there is, in a small sense, a violation of creation, like you've taken from it. Okay? I'm not saying that you go out there and pillage, because we're not allowed to do that. We're going to see that. Because here's the other side of the coin. Creation is to be looked after. You see in chapter 2 that the idea of cultivation, that has within it the idea of working to ensure it continues to sustain, to cultivate something. You work to ensure it continues to sustain. And also to tend. It has the idea of care, to cultivate and to tend. So that's the other side of the coin. You can see there's a tension here. Now, I made a reference before, what does it mean to subdue creation? Well, here's one simple example. I've just built a granny flat on the property of my brother-in-law and sister in Brisbane, because when I'm up in Brisbane I want somewhere to stay, which is quite often, and they just expanded their house and they've got many kids and it's all getting a little bit crazy. So we built this granny flat. The granny flat is air conditioned. The granny flat is nicely furnished. I've been running around on Facebook Marketplace buying up every cheap bargain I can. It's soundproof. That was one decision made in the construction process, to soundproof it, so I can sleep in, because there's children everywhere. Clean water comes out of the taps. Turn the tap on, it's clean, crystal clear. I can drink it. It's been treated for pests. Cockroaches in Brisbane are enormous. It's been treated for pests. It has fly screens up. I can keep the window open without buzzards coming in. The veranda's got a roof over it for shade. The garden, would you believe it, is planted in neat little rows. There's no weeds, they're pulled out. It's all cultivated, it's all the way that it should be. And I can live there. Now the alternative is to go home to Brisbane and sit in the dirt. And probably, ultimately, with this complexion, die. Now here's the question. So what's happened? Actually, I've subdued that plot of creation. That's what I've done. That is, it's been brought under control. It's been made suitable for life. And it was done because there was timber available. Because there's timber plantations where they grow the trees and they cut them down and they've taken from the green plants, that yield blah, 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 and they've used the timber. And sustainability, cultivating and tending, means they plant the tree again. And in a few years' time, they'll cut it down again. It's a steel industry, coal mines, iron ore mines, a shipping system to take it around the world to get it refined and put in furnaces and brought back and manufactured. Or expertise. I mean, people have applied their minds and energies to how do you build stuff that doesn't blow over? How do you make it bushfire safe? How do you do this? How do you do that? In some parts of the world, how do you make it survive an earthquake? And these industries have been built up. Or all sorts of supplies. I had to buy tiles and fixtures and fittings and all this kind of stuff. There is nothing wrong with that kind of enterprise in and of itself, because the creation is for man. And we're told to subdue it and have dominion over it and to live in it and be fruitful and multiply. There's nothing wrong in and of themselves with any of those enterprises. It's amazing to me that has to be said. The order of creation is really turned on its head, where humans are the cancer. Humans are the bad guys. Not in God's order. Humans are to be sustained, and humans are to build, and humans are to grow. It's a very, very different mindset. Now, it's the same thing you see in things like modern medicine. It's the same thing you see in things like crop and food production. I mean, you get sugarcane plantations in North Queensland. They're all growing in rows. You know, the earth's been tilled and all the rest of it, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. All of this is all part of what we are quite supposed and rightly supposed to do in the earth. We're also told to fill the earth. Overpopulation scares have been going on ever since Malthus. It was 200 years ago. And he said, well, we're going to run out of food any day now. Never happened. People find ways to continue to sustain, and the reality is that the world is nowhere near its full population capacity. But God has said, be fruitful and multiply. Overpopulation, therefore, becomes kind of his concern. And you find it is actually invariably, basically, people who are godless who go around and try and control population. That is the impulse of things like Planned Parenthood. That is the impulse of things like a lot of economic development programs that have a population control component to what they're doing. It's not right. It's not the ordinance of life. But here's the other thing. There are limits on our ability and our role as creatures. We don't have a creator role over creation. We have a creature role in creation. It's a significant distinction. Let me point it out this way. There's a really important scripture in Genesis 8 in light of the apocalyptic alarmism that's going on at the moment. Genesis 8:21, it says, the Lord said to himself, this is the Noahic covenant, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. And I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. That's kind of important. Seed time and harvest, summer, winter, day, night, cold, heat, shall not cease. In other words, that's the Creator's role in relation to creation. The overall providential care of the paradigm is the Creator's role. The creature's role within creation is a lesser role. We don't get too big for our boots and say, yes, we can control the entire system. Now, I have no doubt that there is an extent to which we can impact the system. I have no doubt there's an extent to which, when the world is as full as it is and there's as much going on as there is, changes can occur in the system at a small scale. Nonetheless, this is God's promise. And to be honest, a degree of warming, whatever, people will handle it. I'm not saying we do nothing about it because we see, cultivate, tend. Yes, we should improve systems. Yes, we should get cleaner. Yes, we should. But all in the understanding the right order that God has set in creation, which is that creation is for people, creation is to be used in the ways that we've described, and yes, we are to take care of it without getting too big for our boots and assuming that we can control what God has said He is controlling. Okay? So, it's also true, and let me just make this caveat. I've got a couple of caveats, but here's one. I mentioned Romans 8. The creation has fallen. The creation is groaning. The creation is longing for, it's been subjected to futility. It's been subjected to corruption. The creation will change. Weather systems will change. And that has been the story of history. It has been much hotter than it is today. It has been much colder than it is today. And yet God's overall governing paradigm in that promise has never actually been removed. It's always continued. Our role is to cultivate and to tend creation, to care for it and have a degree of responsibility, and get better at it, 100%. Without giving up on our mandate to subdue it, and most of all, without getting too big for our boots and imagining that we can do God's job by controlling the ultimate paradigm. So in other words, should Christians be sustainable? Yes, I think we should. Should Christians respect the environment and promote respect for the environment in practical ways? Yes, we should. 100%. I'm totally not opposed to that. I'm totally in on it. We should seek better ways to do things. We should be cleaner. We should reduce pollutants and so forth. We should innovate. And there's all sorts of very practical and good innovations around food production and resource use and all the rest of it that make us better at what we do, particularly with a view to ensuring that the earth continues to sustain, because that's the idea of cultivating, all within our job of dominion. The problem with, say, much of the extreme edges of the modern climate movement, and by the way, there's political objectives going on here. It's not all scientific, it's political objectives. But the problem with God is that they elevate the inanimate created world above its place in the created order, creation order. Creation order matters. Also, they take up God's role, and not only that, but they object to man's role. They say, no, we shouldn't be doing these things when God has said, go ahead and do it. And then they said, we should be doing these things when God said, I've got that under control. They've inverted the paradigm. And that's the risk of much of this stuff that's going on in the modern world. So, 3 deductions. 1, the climate apocalypse won't happen. 2, using the Earth's resources is not wrong. 3, responsibility about how we do that is essential. Those are the 3 things from the creation order in relation to the environment at large. So, what I'm going to do there is take a 5-minute break. So come back, the clock up there's always different to what I've got. According to the clock on the wall, come back at 10 o'clock and we'll get into a couple more. This is bad. I don't think I'm going to finish my content today. We're going to have to spill over, and I said I wouldn't do that. Anyway, we'll see. We'll see. That's all right. It'll work out. So the next thing I want to pick up and mention is work. Work. You notice that in paradise, man was given work to do, and there was industry. There was things to apply oneself to in work. Now, that is a creation ordinance which is, I think, little respected and little understood. It's picked up in a couple of other places, but one passage is in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. Maybe I'll just read it, I think. It's not so important that you turn to it, but you can make the note of 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. And I'll start from verse 6. The Apostle Paul is talking about the implications of not working. And he says, "Now we command you, brothers and sisters, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you keep away from every brother or sister who leads a disorderly life, and not one in accordance with the tradition which you received from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to follow our example, because we did not act in an undisciplined way among you, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with labour and hardship we kept working night and day, so that we would not be a burden to any of you. Not because we do not have the right to do this, but in order to offer ourselves as a role model for you, so that you would follow our example. For even when we were with you, we used to give you this order: if anyone is not willing to work, then he is not to eat either. For we hear that some among you are leading an undisciplined life, doing no work at all, but acting like busybodies. Now we command and exhort such persons in the Lord Jesus Christ to work peacefully and eat their own bread. But as for you, brothers and sisters, do not grow weary of doing good." So notice something here. He's not talking about people who can't work. He's not talking about people who are so disabled that they are unable to work or they have some other impediment. He's talking about people who won't work. They won't, and they can. Now, labouring for food is a reality of the fall, Genesis 3:19. "By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread," says God. But work itself is, industry and discipline and work, those both go into the mandate of work, is a creation blueprint. Genesis 2:15, man is placed in the garden to work it and to keep it. And the practice of leading a disciplined and orderly and godly life entails work. It entails work. Work is not a necessary evil. We are called to be industrious people. We must take up tasks to do. We must apply discipline to them, and we must be industrious, and we must work. And now there's variance. I'm not saying, we're sort of conditioned at this point suddenly to say, okay, the only thing you're talking about is the traditional sense of a career. Now that's not always going to work out for everybody. The overarching principle here is don't be undisciplined. Lead a productive life of discipline. And of course, that's a broad principle because as we know, our nature's fall in Adam's image means that our inclinations, our desires, our personhood is unruly, it is given to disorder, and it is given to dissipation, and it is given to lack of discipline. And if we do not learn to bring ourselves under the control of what is right and right standards and learn discipline, then of course we're compromised in our Christian life. And the learning of discipline is, I think, a lost virtue. It's a lost virtue. I look at people like my grandparents and I think, man alive, I'm so undisciplined. There was a generation that just, they just is, I think, he's not here. Good. Stephen Shavura, I can talk about him. He is a very disciplined man. And that's one of the things I respect about him. The discipline of reading for a minimum set time every single day. And look at the rewards. Look at how it has changed him. Look at what he knows when he gets up here. It's ridiculous. He's heard his voice. He's heard his name. He's coming. But the lost art of discipline is a very serious thing, and it's a really strong generational issue. Everyone act cool when he walks in. I want to say this in particular, and if I get to the end, I'm going to sledge the women as well, so I'm going to sledge the guys right now. I was thinking the other day, what are male sins and female sins? I'll keep the female ones for a while. But I thought, what are male sins? And of course, everyone commits all sins. But what's something that's particularly male at the moment? And the word I came up with in my head was indolence. Indolence. I should have looked it up in the dictionary, but I think I know what it means. Which is that it's kind of stubborn idleness, directionless, lack of impetus to do anything. Video games, YouTube and pornography. Is that not the sin of young men? What do you achieve? Sitting on your computer looking at YouTube and cat videos and how to carve a table and random snippets from random TV shows for hours. It's lack of discipline. And the other sad thing is that I'm seeing so many, and I've connected this in with some advice my dad gave me at school. A lot of young guys can't finish things. The starting of a program or a course or an accreditation and quitting. It's so common. And never achieving, never finishing, never being faithful to what you have in front of you and disciplining yourself to get there. And I don't want to, if there's women in the room to whom this applies, listen up. I don't want to be too sexist. And that's really sad because what I see is they fail. They don't really maybe just check out, but they don't achieve, and then they become afraid of trying. And they never become men. And my dad was wise. He said when I was young, he said, you must achieve something. I used to say this to me all the time. You must. And if you started something and then you started going, I'm not sure, I don't know, he'd say, finish it, keep going, and he wouldn't give you an out unless there was a really good reason. And of course, circumstances always can provide valid reasons and circumstances, and that's fine. But if it's just for the reason of, I don't know what to do with my life, I'm just not sure, finish it. And he did this to me and my brother. My brother went into a trade and he pushed him so hard to finish his trade. And with me, he pushed me hard to achieve things. Whether it was, because for me it was the mind, for my brother it was the hands, and for me he'd push me for, I always tell this story, oh no, maybe I won't, don't worry about it. Let's forget about the personal stuff. The importance of discipline cannot be underestimated. And a key way of discipline is to find industry, is to find work. Now there are some people who are full-time carers. That's industry and that's work. And here's something, one of the most underrated industries and works in the modern society, in fact completely rejected and marginalised, is the industry and work of being a mother. And there's many people who are involved in that, and they are looking after, and look, they might be doing industry and work of motherhood and looking after a family and part-time work somewhere else. The Apostle Paul says, redeem the time for the days are evil. In other words, don't waste it. Get on with it. And that is such a strong command today when we waste time. Now, I get it, don't burn yourself out. Some of us have been there, it's not fun. But don't waste time. Use it, and use it well. And that's where this creation ordinance of work becomes a spiritual discipline. And discipline is connected to our relationship to Christ. Because at its core, to be conformed to Christ is a question of discipline. There's a lot of people who go around and say, I just can't shake this sinful proclivity, or I just can't energize myself to, I'm speaking to myself here, I can't energize myself to get on that bandwagon and do that thing consistently. Do you know what? Sometimes the only advice is just do it. Just do it. I'm sorry there's no silver bullet. It's hard, right? Life's hard. Get on with it. It stinks, I know. Getting up at 5 o'clock every morning, if that's what you think you need to do to get up and pray and, improve your spiritual life and do some exercise and then get to work and that's how you function. Right, I wish that I could do that myself all the time, but sometimes you're just knackered and you can't. But I know people who are so disciplined that it's built into them like clockwork and they'll just do it. And the rewards, the dividends that it pays in their relationship to Christ is huge. And there's nothing sadder, and I've met people who don't work. And they can, and they just don't. It's no place to be, and it's actually a bad Christian testimony. And there are some people who pretend they can't, but they can. Now, sometimes that's a psychological thing that needs to be resolved, and that's okay. That should be resolved. But we must put our minds to the discipline and the industry of work. So work is not a necessary evil. Work is essential. We honour the creation ordinance of industry and discipline, and we do it for our own good. We do it because it dignifies people. And this is something which is a high priority not just for us, but it ought to be a high priority for governments, because creation ordinances are for all people. And in fact, all these creation ordinances are relevant to government. Government policy and ideas that undermine the dignity and importance of work must be avoided. I'm sounding a little bit like a Liberal Party hack here. I'm totally not meaning to. It's just a fact. Jobs are important. Unfortunately, there's a slight perversion sometimes in the way that jobs mantra is presented, though. One of the things I really don't like is that they are obsessed, and I do mean single-mindedly obsessed, with getting both parents into the workforce. They're obsessed with it. And I just think that's wrong. That's not the mighty dollar is not the thing you serve. It's not about, they turn it into a dollars equation. This is actually a virtue equation, and so there's other things to consider as well. But also, I think of things like the universal minimum wage. That would have the effect, because I've worked in youth ministry and I've worked in low socioeconomic areas, and I can tell you now there's plenty of people who would just say, sweet, we're never going to work again. And many of them don't already because of the welfare system. And that's where it corrupts, and it does wrong, because you are undermining that. You're actually hurting people, because in God's creation ordinance, this is good. This is important. Work matters. And an attack on work, remember this principle right back from the start, an attack on work is an attack on the Creator. Because undisciplined people, well, they're not actually conformed to His image. And it actually degrades people. It's an attack on people, it's an attack on the Creator. The next creation blueprint is an interesting one. It's Sabbath. By the way, the really juicy stuff is marriage and male and female. And I think I'm going to have to wait till tomorrow for it. Sorry. I'm like, maybe there'll be an earthquake overnight and I won't have to do it. So Sabbath is the much more boring intermediary topic, but it's not actually that boring. I want to make a point here. The notion of Sabbath, it appears in three places. It appears in creation, it appears in the Ten Commandments, and it appears in the ceremonial laws of the nation of Israel. It appears in three places. Here's the problem. It appears in creation. Therefore, we have to reckon with it. Therefore, it is relevant. It's not just some curiosity of ancient Israel and God's ceremonial laws and feast days and Sabbaths and all the rest of it and that kind of thing. That's not all it is. It's a creation thing. So it actually does matter today for us. Bear that in mind. It says in Genesis that God blessed the seventh day, or God blessed the Sabbath, and He made it holy, and in it He rested. And the fact of its institution in creation is brought up in the New Testament. It's brought up particularly in Hebrews chapter 3 and chapter 4. But its application is also given to us in two places, Hebrews 3 and 4, and also in Matthew 11, where Jesus gives an application. But first of all, let me note this. Hebrews 4 teaches us what the Sabbath means. It teaches, or the creation Sabbath, what it means. There is an ultimate rest in God. That's what it means. For God's people, the Sabbath is an enduring symbol of that reality, that there is rest for the people of God. It reminds me of that very famous quote of St. Augustine, "Our hearts are restless till they find their rest in you." the idea that there is ultimate and final rest from works. And that's really what happens in salvation. We rest, that's one of the ways it's put in the New Testament, we rest from our works because Christ has done it for us. That's important. Hebrews 4 also teaches us that salvation, belief in the gospel by faith, brings us into that promised and foreshadowed rest. I'm going to read this in a minute and it'll be very clear. But it brings us into that promised and foreshadowed rest. Unbelief shuts us out of God's rest. It also implores us to enter God's rest today. It says, there is a day and it's today. By all means now, it says. It's like a real old-fashioned evangelistic, you could have a car accident on your way home and die, and then you'd, and be saved now. That's what Hebrews chapter 4 is saying. And it's got strong warnings about unbelief. So let me just read it and signpost as I go through. So just listen, I'll emphasize. It says, therefore we must fear if while a promise remains of entering his rest, any one of you may seem to have come short of it. For indeed we have had good news preached to us, just as they also did. He's referring to the children of Israel in the wilderness who failed to enter. God said they won't enter my rest. He's referring to the promised land, but he says, just as they also did. But the word they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united to those who listened with faith. For we who have believed enter that rest. Just as he has said, as I swore in my anger, they shall not enter my rest, although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. So he's going back to creation, saying this is a creation rest. For he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. Somewhere, happens to be in Genesis. And again, I might start doing that. It says somewhere, I don't have to remember the references. For he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this passage, they certainly shall not enter my rest. Therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and those who previously had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience, he again sets a certain day, today, saying through David after so long a time, just as he had said before, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua, who led them into the promised land, had given them rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that. Consequently, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. Therefore, let us make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will fall by following the same example of disobedience. We who have believed enter that rest. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people. The creation Sabbath rest is foreshadowing the rest that God has for his people in the gospel of Jesus Christ. What's at the center of that? Well, in Matthew chapter 11, there's a very famous verse which you will all know, where Jesus stands up on the Sabbath day and he says, "Come unto me, all you who labour and are burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, for I am meek and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And then it says, and at that time, Jesus walked through the grain fields on the Sabbath and was picking I think it was the ears of corn or whatever, and the Pharisees got upset, and he said, that's really not the point. And he finishes in verse 8 of chapter 12. He says, "For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." So the big lesson is that he is Lord of the Sabbath, that is Jesus, and that he is ushering in the rest that the Sabbath symbolizes and points forward to. It is fulfilled in him. I find rest for your souls in me, he says, on the Sabbath day. Hebrews confirms it, that it's in the gospel and belief that there's a rest for the people of God. Therefore, the Sabbath day, and there are, apology, anyway, there are differences of view on this, but I just want to explain why I'm saying what I'm saying. The Sabbath as ceremony is fulfilled in Jesus. The Sabbath as ceremony. Now, what do I mean by as ceremony? What are the ceremonies? Well, you think, for example, of the sacrifice system. Jesus is the sacrifice. It's not just done away with, it's fulfilled, it's answered. Or you think of feast days and various things like that, like the Passover. What was the blood on the doorpost that saved them from death? Jesus. He's come, it's fulfilled, it's answered. And this whole system was pointing people forward. And I think we underestimate just how much the Old Testament Jews understood this. They actually did. I mean, so many times in the New Testament, even from the words of Jesus himself, he confirms what they knew and understood about him. About, Abraham rejoiced to see my day and was glad, he says. Job says, in my flesh I shall see God. I know my Redeemer lives. These guys understood far more than we give them credit for. And you can go through the Bible and find these clear examples of the fact that many of them knew what they were doing was pointing forward to an ultimate answer in God's provision, and it was Christ. Or you can think even of the tabernacle, this intricately built. I mean, try and read Leviticus sometimes. It goes on and on and on about acorns and carvings and silvers and, curtains and all this kind of stuff. When you do your read through the Bible in a year thing, Leviticus, I'm just like, yeah. I'm sure it all is really important and means something, but I'm not fully sure what. Except this. When you get to Hebrews, you find out that it was a pattern of the things in heaven. And the whole idea that there was a high priest who went into the holiest of places and brought the people to God and made atonement for the sins of the people. Who's the high priest? Jesus. Where's the holiest place really? It's in the throne room of heaven. Where's Jesus? In the throne room of heaven. He's done it once forever, it says. So all these things are fulfilled. The Sabbath as ceremony also is fulfilled in Jesus. But the Sabbath as creation ordinance endures. That's significant. It still is here with us. Therefore, it is my firm conviction that we ought to have a day of rest in God once a week. We ought to have a day of rest in God once a week. Now, that principle is clear. The practice of it varies fairly widely, but the principle is clear. You say, well, why is it that the enormous majority of the church, Protestant, Catholic and Orthodox, has had their Sabbath on Sunday, the first day of the week? It's just the Seventh-day Adventists that continue to have their Sabbath on the Saturday, the seventh day of the week. Why? Well, it's a practice that goes all the way back to the early church when they decided to meet on the first day of the week. And basically people take three scriptures to indicate that the day is not important. And these are the three. Colossians 2:16, therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food and drink or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are only a shadow of what was to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. In other words, he's saying these things are shadows of the substance in Christ. And he's then saying, what he's saying there is actually these things are fulfilled. These things are fulfilled. But he goes on in Romans 14:5 to say one person values one day over another, another values every day the same. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. Galatians 4:9-11, but now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how is it that you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles to which you want to be enslaved all over again? You meticulously observe days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that perhaps I have laboured over you in vain. What he's basically saying is a lot of this stuff, your fastidiousness over it, your enslavement to it is no longer necessary because Christ has come. He's making the clear point as well that, look, the day, the exactness of it, it's not that important. The important thing is the principles at work. And people take those three verses basically to indicate that, okay, the day doesn't, that must be why the early church decided the specific day wasn't so important. And ever since it's been that way. So I want to say again, the principle of a day of rest in God still holds because of creation. I failed in this regard when I first took this job, and I finished the year in hospital with pneumonia. So the Sabbath is for man. Okay, the Sabbath is for your good. The Sabbath is important. And this is something I actually went back to, thinking, how can I straighten my life out? And here we are. One answer is, do this. And it's difficult for those who have jobs where Sunday is a work day. Because, in ministry in particular, Sunday is a work day. What do you do? Okay, the practice varies. The principle holds. Find out what it is that you can do. The ordinance is good for us and it honours God, and it is tremendously good for our growth in Christ and our sanctification. It's really important. It actually makes, and this is again a question of discipline, right? How the discipline feeds into so many of these things. Incidentally, this was, and Steve would be the right person to talk about this, maybe he's mentioned it, this was a huge part of society for many, many, many years. Sunday trading was not a thing. People were given the freedom. People were given the ability to actually have a Sabbath. I remember watching, I think it's an old Sherlock Holmes movie set in Scotland where there's a shipwreck off the coast of Scotland and all the whiskey of the ship is falling into the sea. And you see all these guys sitting in the pub like looking out at the sea like... And you sort of think, what's going on? And then the clock strikes midnight on Sunday night and they all go charging down the beach. And anyway, we're not going to be like that. I don't even know why I thought of that. But nonetheless, the idea of this 24-hour period was serious. It really was a part of society. And you know, again, I'm saying too much about my roots. You're all going to start getting very scared and skeptical. But, you know, it's interesting to me, and I've only really realised this in hindsight, my parents were pretty fastidious about this. And I you know, not going to church on Sunday was not within the realm of possibilities. You might as well fly to the moon. If you were like, I'm sick today, it's like, get in the car! You know, like, you had no choice. And I think between the age of 0, or maybe 3, let's say, between the age of 3 and 24, when I left home, I think I missed Sunday morning church once. What? And I was like throwing up on the floor. I was so sick. And I was allowed to stay home. And my parents were just, they never did. And any time if I was in the middle of exams and I was totally snowed under and I'd go, Dad, you know, I don't think I'm going to make it to church today. You know, I'm just so busy. I've got a test tomorrow. And he'd go, you'll never be worse off for doing the right thing. God will see to it. And I just went, oh. You know, okay, I'll come. You know, and I just didn't have a choice. But that was true, by the way. Actually, it was a true statement. But I just make these points to say this has been a significant part of society. And look, there are some people who will go to great lengths. You know, there are still people who won't get on a bus on a Sabbath day. There are still people who won't go to the shops on a Sabbath day because they don't want to endorse Sunday trading. Fine, whatever. I'm not going to sit here and go, ha ha, you're so stupid and quaint. It's in people's convictions, that's fine. I personally don't take it that far, but the idea of 1 day in 7, rest in God, taken seriously, is actually a very important creation reality that I think each of us do well to observe. It's good for us, and it also honours God. And would you look at that? We just haven't had the time to get to... Oh, what a shame. Yeah. Galatians 4, 9 to 11. Yep, 4, 9 to 11. So... I actually will pick up the remainder of that. I will do it tomorrow because I said I would, and actually it's pretty important, and it is very, very timely. So I will pick that up tomorrow, and also we'll spend the remainder of tomorrow going through the topic. I trust, depending how the rest of my day plays out, it's always unpredictable, we'll go through the topic of the anatomy of evil, in which we will talk about what happened in the fall and what it actually teaches us about the nature of evil, sin, and all those kinds of things. There's some very serious lessons. So thank you all very much. It's 10:30.